It gives me great pleasure to be here. It's an honor and a privilege to be with you this morning delivering the leçon inaugurale de l'école de Chaillot. It is a hard act to follow, as you heard the list of people who gave the lecture before me. And I don't know, I hope to be able to set a good precedence for women who will come later, because I think it's just a mishap that a woman hasn't given this lecture before. I wish to thank also Mireille Grubert for inviting me to give this lecture, and her team, especially Antoine, for the organization. Guillaume Selem for his support and enthusiasm for having me here, Marie-Hélène Contal for instigating this, and Jana Revedin for originally recognizing our work and bringing it to the forefront. I have since 2012 acquired in the Cité a generous collaborating institution with supportive colleagues and friends, and a relationship that has really been invaluable both professionally and academically. I should also tell you that because this lecture is going to be published, I had to put myself through the exercise of writing an introduction so we can have enough material. I never give a lecture and read at the same time. I always kind of like to indulge my audience in the work that we are doing, and probably it very much applies to what Corbusier once said. Le Corbusier, when he came to visit the AA in the 50s, he came to dinner and he was asked to give a speech, and he said, "I detest talk about architecture. I don't want to talk about architecture." And then he said, "Architecture is for doing, not for talking about." But I actually think the time has come for us to talk about architecture and not just to do. But in the presentation, you will find that I will show most of the slides and then the experience and experiment. And there's a lot of material to look at because I was asked to cover an extraordinary period of my work, which I have not done before. As an architect, I have been concerned and engaged in unmapped towns and cities where I work with an architecture of complex depth and meaning, as opposed to following a specific wave of an emerging or escalating trend of practice that may be more appealing, established, and publicized in the field. On a personal level, which I tend to discuss less, and across the years of thinking and working as an architect, I realized that the decision to work with an unidentified or unqualified form of contemporary vernacular architecture that is associated with the cities and urban culture of an inscrutable East, where I come from, the region outside the accepted norm of modern Western practice, probably, is a difficult terrain to negotiate, let alone sustain. However, this different route that has been novel and equally rewarding provided a constant edge by virtue of the unfailing need, attraction, inspiration, and the knowledge it communicates and contains. It is the design paradigm of a higher order that I wish to show you today. I was born in Beirut, I'm not Lebanese, and lived there and in Baghdad, Iraq, where I come from, and associate with as a point of reference. I left to study architecture in England at the Architectural Association, as mentioned by Mireille. It's better known as the AA. And since that was in 1972. Since qualifying, I went to Cairo, Yemen, worked in Morocco, and Abu Dhabi. And Oman. There was an interlude 10 years after I graduated in 77, or 7 years later. I went back to London and applied to the Royal College of Art to do a PhD. But the reason I wanted to do a PhD was not to be qualified with a degree, but to have the pretext to go to Yemen, because Yemen was a very closed country, and I had already been introduced to the country, and I needed an official position, be it academic or otherwise, to be able to go and do this research. So I got my PhD from the Royal College of Art in 1984. I went back for a period after the Royal College of Art. I did Morocco and Oman and Abu Dhabi, and I went back to Yemen. So I have worked in various countries of the region that is known as the Arab world. And then I delved into Iran a bit, and at the moment I have a project in India, in Rajasthan. I continue, however, to consider London the city where I am based, travel from and return, even though I'm living in Beirut at the moment. Estranged from one's country, other horizons are gained, new frontiers set in, with a repertoire of invariably changing situations and possibilities. Architecture has certainly equipped me with the intellectual and visual training, coupled by a restless, underpinning passion to explore, appreciate, and fathom spaces I dwelt in since and continue to work with. Between Samarra, the Mosque of Samarra, which I'll show you, of the Abbasids, and the Cordoba Mosque in Granada are two unmatched pillars I consider as ultimate works of architecture to contemplate, lessons of ingenious design in a school of thought that was absent from my architectural curricula. Extant here is the present force of architecture, the present as opposed to the past, one that continues to speak to us. Hence, the false premise of a general divide drawn in understanding the idea and concept of past and present. To be modern, you can hardly dismiss the dialect or the dialectic still at work with former or earlier works of architecture. The involvement extends from being strongly drawn and involved to a special form of engagement with the architecture and its inhabitants and principal users and builders, of course, that which inadvertently turns into a life contract rather than a short-term project or assignment. Such is the nature of an architecture of environment and principle that is larger than us, the architects. The world of architecture we inhabit is terribly ill-defined and not often possible to discern and operate unhindered within. The restrictions imposed, whether cultural, political, bureaucratic, and financial, continue to riddle and impede, as well as provide challenges and openings on other diverse levels. If you operate in the field outside the architecture office practice or norm, one is conversely sometimes identified as a specialist in vague matter related to heritage, theory, or conservation. What I have argued throughout is that one is not an historian or restorer or any other vague matter on the side, and that I essentially am an architect and I work as an architect. Of course, I'm not going to bore you with the rest of all this text because it will be published, so not to worry. I'll just read the last section and then I'll get on. I was also fortunate to have been studying at an institution radical like the AA school was during the 70s. Architects who came and went included a wide list from Peter Cook, Kenneth Frampton, Dalibor Vasily, Richard Rogers, Rem Koolhaas, Leon Krier, Rick Mather, James Sterling, and Renzo Piano. And to be honest with you, these are just the few names I could remember. These are the people who were part of the institution. A few names I recall of others who have since shaped much of contemporary architectural theory and practice. I was a student of Keith Critchlow, author of Order in Space, which was published in 1972. He had worked with Buckminster Fuller on geodesic geometry, geodesic domes in geometry. Keith was already specialized in the construction of geometric polygons and entered into the analysis of Islamic geometric patterns. He instilled the understanding and development of this universal order and system found in Plato's Timaeus and expanded in Islamic sciences. He reminded us, actually, that it's the Arabic word for architect was or is still muhandis, meaning geometrician. An authority in both the practical construction and philosophy, his seminal work remains unique and advanced. The understanding of the geometric order and discipline acquired from Keith Critchlow, that I acquired from Keith Critchlow, was accompanied by the work of Issam Said, who was an Iraqi architect, artist, and author of Geometric Concepts in Islamic Art in 1976. Issam was working separately, investigating the same field in Islamic art and architecture based on Arab sources, such as Ikhwan al-Safa, Farabi, and Ibn Sina are noted and renowned scientists. I introduced the two to each other, and Issam offered to tutor 4 of us who were at the AA in the construction and analysis of geometric concepts in architecture. Weekly classes were held at his kitchen table in London, Redcliffe Square, with sweet Iraqi tea perfumed with cardamom. Zaha Hadid, who was a close friend and colleague, was one of the regulars of the 4. Critchlow recognized the importance of Fathi's work. With Albin Boyarsky, the chairman of the AA, they sanctioned my decision to spend the 4th school year of my education at the AA in Cairo instead of London. The year was 1975-76. The talk is actually structured in 5 sections. The first section is on geometry, which you just heard. The second section is on Hassan Fathi. And the third section is on Yemen. 4th is on an interlude in Abu Dhabi, just to show you how the professional works with the other side that some might consider outside the profession or the other architecture. And then the final section is on the return to Yemen and the projects that we do in Thank you. Right. So the part 1 is what I call a point of reference, being the geometric formation. And it's essentially to point out that much of the architecture that you might see of the edifices, of the beautiful edifices, whether of the Abbasid palace you're looking at of the 12th and 13th century period, which was one of the strongest periods I consider, or one of the most solid periods of architecture that I consider most inspiring in the Islamic era or in Islamic architecture in general, is that of the Abbasids, who were terribly original. They were also the trendsetters, if you like, and they disowned the architecture of the Umayyads that was influenced by Byzantine architecture, and therefore decided to kind of invent and create forms that are rather classic forms that we consider a huge point of inspiration. Out of this, we later see that the influence of squinches, or what you were looking at, the pendentive triangles, was adopted and became a trend that followed in places and in again, other stunning examples like the Palace of Comares in Al-Hamra that you can see in front of you, which belonged to the 14th century. This, notwithstanding, is to understand that this geometry is actually not about just a beautiful shape or a beautiful pattern. The geometric formation I was talking to you about was one affiliated to how these patterns are constructed that you see below. The one below is, of course, from the Comares Palace, the one I showed you a bit earlier from the 14th century, the best part of which were constructed between 1333 and 1354. Now, if you look at this slide, you will see that we're looking at 3 different issues here. The one on the left is the actual formation as invented or constructed, not invented really, but kind of constructed by Issam Said, who created the idea of the unit, or illustrated how the unit is always created inside the circle, which was documented actually by Ikhwan al-Safa in their treatise. And then on the right, you will find the development of this pattern here, and that leads to what we see as the drawings, the patterns or the drawings that are illustrated. It is often been told that because Islam prohibited the use of figurative form, abstract forms like calligraphy and abstract arts like calligraphy and geometry became the given form that, or art that was developed. But you will see that geometry actually, firstly, figurative art was continued to be used in all the palaces of the caliphs. It was just later that they decided that, you know, it was not favored as opposed to being prohibited. But the important thing about the geometry is that it's a universal language that was used all across the Islamic world in architecture and in design as it was in town planning. The same idea that I showed you earlier, first in the Abbasid squinches, later 14th century in Cordoba, and now this is the floor of the Agra Mosque, Agra Taj Mahal, built for Mumtaz Mahal in the 17th century, and it was only completed in 1643 on the 12th anniversary of her death. And you will see that the floor there is again based on a square pattern, based on the polygon of the square, and this is used in the pavement. On the right, you will see, the next slide, you will see the pattern that's based on the triangle, which is one of the most important polygons that Plato talked of, and it's considered as an important formation in the various, even in the physics and the DNA of our own body, and not only in the relationship of the star and constellation. So there's the relationship between the macrocosm in one sense and the microcosm, the universe and the unit. And there's the other relationship, which is very important and relates to what we'll be working on, and that is the relationship between the apparent, what you see, which is the design on the right-hand side, this beautiful design from the tomb of I'timad al-Dawla, and on the left is the real. This is the actual real matter that brings the variation or illustrates the various forms that you look at. These two screens, known as jali in Indian, are from the maqbara or the cemetery of I'timad al-Dawla. His name was the pillar, known as the Pillar of the Empire, and it was built by Nur Jahan, 1622, and finished in 1628. And again, you will see the two forms. The pattern on the left is one that is based on the square. The pattern on the right is one based on the hexagon and the triangle. And why I'm showing you these is to tell you that Islamic art and architecture, similar to vernacular art, was always governed by a discipline. And that discipline essentially was a discipline of order. This same discipline, which exists to regulate and articulate the relationship, for example, between the body of the human being and the pentagon, or the proportion that exists between the various parts of the body and how they relate to each other, in the same way that there is a relationship and proportion between architecture and the town plan. So the unit to the creation of a pattern, which is created through repetition and affinity. Once you create the unit in the geometry, you repeat it to affinity and it gives you this pattern, again, based on certain rules, was, if you can imagine, the architecture that repeats and creates the town plan, again, based on a discipline and certain rules. So on the left-hand side, you see the work of a calligrapher And one of the names of Allah or God in one of the 99 names, interestingly enough, is Al-Muhit. Al-Muhit means the circumference. It also means the globe. And below is the calligrapher who wrote the top one, called Ustad Hassan Shalabi. He's Turkish, and he was doing this in 2009 in Istanbul. On the right-hand side, you will see an illustration of Keith Critchlow's of Ibn Muqla's theory on the relationship of the calligraphy to geometry. And again, it goes down to the point, which is the center of the circle, and that point and the number of point gives us the same proportion as the Aleph, the first letter of the alphabet, and it is through this formation that the rest of the letters are written. So everything is created through a certain form of equilibrium, or what is known in Arabic as al-mizan. Everything is very carefully scrutinized. And if you look at the plans that you see in front of you, the one on the right-hand side is one of the Hyder Palace, one of the earliest, very sophisticated examples of palace architecture. It was built, Hyder is near Baghdad, very little is left of it, and it was built in 775. 8th century. It's one of the earliest Abbasid examples. And you can see the complexity, but more importantly, I'm interested in showing you how the geometry applies to the plan in the same way that you saw it illustrated in the pattern. This analysis that you see is the same one that we use also in the analysis of facades of buildings and sections. We use it to analyze the architects and the craftsmen actually set it up before it was designed. So it's true that we don't have, that our builders do not have working drawings, but they did have a system and a setup to contend with and operate. And for a long time, this information was considered to be elitist and was kept amongst those who knew, and including the elite knowers, if you like, or the Gnostics and our Sufi masters. This is the building I referred to a bit earlier. It's the known as the Malwiya, which means it's a helicoidal tower that was constructed by Al-Mutawakkil, who built the Great Mosque of Samarra. And this minaret I consider one of the most stupendous examples of architecture. It's a helicoidal tower with 5 revolutions, and it was built between 848 and 852. That's the period of constructing the mosque. Nothing is left of the mosque. However, if you consider that this minaret that you're looking at, constructed out of bricks, baked bricks, is actually still standing, still over millennia now. It's 53 meters high, 174 feet, and as I said, it has 5 revolutions. This is a plan on the left-hand side showing the location. Here, I don't know if, yes, this is the minaret, and it's one of the first examples of a minaret that's actually set outside the precinct of the mosque. The mosque is, as you can see, a courtyard with a huge courtyard. It's the Great Mosque of Samarra, and it was the largest Grand Mosque or Friday Mosque of its time. More importantly is that this building, the Malwiya that I showed you earlier, was constructed in such a way where the Khalifa or the Caliph al-Mutawakkil used to actually mount it every day on his horse and command a view of his caliphate or small kingdom, because the Abbasid Caliph prior to him moved the caliphate outside Baghdad to contain his Turkish troops. And they built this new city called Samarra, of which very little remains, unfortunately. So he used to mount his Malwiya all the way up to get a better command of his small kingdom. The next example, which I still find one of the most inspiring examples, and I visit it as much as possible, and I consider these two to be like the Mecca of the architect in me at least, is the Mosque of Cordoba. And this was built by Abdurrahman first. But what's important about this mosque is just not the creation or the creativity of its arches to achieve and the height of the arches in order to achieve this double height and double support, but it's also the fact that this is a building that was constructed and went on being extended and expanded for over 3 centuries. So it also talks about architecture, and this is a view of the plan. On the left-hand side, you can see the church that was constructed later on, and then you can see the forest, literally a forest of columns that it's made out of. But it has such a magical quality about it. And this magical quality and this sense that you feel, this great sense of wellness and beauty and kind of content or inspiration that you feel when you're there, is completely based on this system of geometry and proportion. From there, I will take you to Cairo, where you find the Mosque of Ibn Tulun that you're looking at was definitely, is quite well established by architectural historians, and I'm not one, by the way, that it was influenced by Samarra. And in fact, the Mr. Ibn Tulun, the caliph himself, grew up in the Abbasid courts in Baghdad, so there was that influence. And you can see that the section that you're looking at, the fountain and the dome, actually dates from the 13th century. It's a bit later. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but it might be worth mentioning, not that it means much. And in fact, sorry, the slide on the right-hand side, you see the soffit of an arch, again with a geometric pattern. And these patterns here are just an indicator. They're not the decoration that they appear to be or the ornament they appear to be. They are just a manifest or a sign, if you like, of the type of geometry and system that went into its making. But maybe you have noticed, maybe you have not, but the ablutionary area, which is what you're looking at, it's just actually a fountain. It's not an ablution with the dome on it, is the building that inspired EMP to create the contemporary Islamic Museum in Doha. So it's worth noting that a simple fountain created in the 13th century created kind of the point of inspiration and indeed a good point of reference to EMP for the building, which is applauded as one of the most interesting buildings, etc., or blah, blah. However, I don't know if you also noticed that the Melwiya I showed you a bit earlier inspired another architect to construct a museum in New York, no other than the Guggenheim. And this did not come by coincidence. Frank Lloyd Wright, Gropius, Le Corbusier, and a few other architects were invited to come to Baghdad in 1956 by the government of the deceased king, or deposed or murdered king, who was removed in 1958. They were asked to come and set up various projects, and these are all well documented in edition of the Japanese magazine Process. And Le Corbusier's project, incidentally, was constructed much later in the 80s by Saddam Hussein, interestingly enough. And Gropius's entrance to the building, to the university, was also of Baghdad in Jadriya, was also constructed, and so was his mosque, I believe. But Frank Lloyd Wright, I don't think did any projects there, but at least was influenced by constructing the Guggenheim. Now, Hassan Fethi, unfortunately, I had a very small section of a film, which I'm told is not going to run, but I will talk a bit about it. I met Hassan Fethi in Beirut in 1972. It was the first year of my architectural education. I had just finished my first year at the AA, and I was in Beirut, and I met him by coincidence. But this story actually was recorded, and you'll find it on YouTube, I think. It was recorded in a film or interview done by me. It was a coincidence meeting, and from then on, I kept seeing him. I was reading his book, Architecture for the Poor, which was recommended to you. And I went to Cairo soon afterwards, then decided to join him. And this is a view on the left of Hassan Fethi on his terrace, where he used to take people up every afternoon, and whoever knew him would have known his beautiful house in Fort Darb al-Labana, where he lived, in the Citadel area. And you can see the Citadel behind the HLM building there on the left. And the irony is that his apartment, which was a 17th century Mamluk apartment, looked over this incredible view, and on the other hand, the entrance to his building was through the modern building there. He also always liked to compare the cactus and the shape of the cactus with the shape of the minaret and the musicality that he saw in the townscape. Now, this is a film, a segment of a film that I had, which I'm told is not working. I'm sorry. And in it, a friend who is...
Hassan Fethi, qui êtes-vous?
Je suis un architecte qui a perdu tout point de repère dans sa société arabe. Je suis un architecte arabe et qui a perdu tout point de repère dans sa société arabe, qui a perdu son arabité. Et je suis en train de me rechercher en architecture et en urbanisme. Retrouver, chercher et retrouver mon arabité perdue.
So I thought this was the voice of the poet and philosopher Abdul Wahab Medib asking Hassan Fethi, qui êtes-vous? So and I just wanted to put this section in because it's very indicative of Hassan Fethi's battle, if you like, with his projects, and the fact that his battle, I consider, was a battle against alienation. So what he mentions about his looking for his identity as an Arab architect was extremely important and extremely courageous of him at a time like we're talking of 1975, when everybody was already on cloud nine, trying, especially in that part of the world, trying to be modern and Western and all that jazz. But out of his terrace, we look out and we find also the view that you saw in the distance, the building on the left, which is the Sultan Hassan Mosque. And these are the minarets from the other two mosques, the Rifai. Sultan Hassan was important because whenever Hassan Fethi took us there or took his visitors there, and it's a madrasa actually, not just a mosque. It's the madrasa of Al-Nasir, Sultan Al-Nasir Hassan, and it was constructed in the 13th century, in 1223. And the entire courtyard is paved in marble. And pointing at the madrasa pavement, Hassan Fethi would look at this and he would announce, he would say, "This is town planning," pointing to the floor. And the reason, what he meant by this is precisely what I was trying to tell you earlier, about the unit, about the repetition, about the proportion. And he would point at it, and for him, this was how you should understand town planning and the complexity of it. And Hassan Fethi's words were also very simple. He was a man who was poetic, he was a dreamer, and he was a terribly good designer as far as I was concerned. And his main concern, as probably you know, and I'm not here to talk really about him, but to show how his life influenced me, how working with him has influenced my life, and possibly I'm still influenced by his life because I still think of him all the time. and miss him. But essentially, it's to show that he also was concerned in two major issues. The first that you see in the photograph on the left, where the construction with vaults and mud brick vaults and domes and stone. And this photograph was taken in 1973, and I cannot remember which house it was. I'm sorry, but I know that the furniture is similar to his upholstery, so it might have been in Sidi Krer. And the one on the right was taken by a friend and colleague photographer who lived in Egypt at the time, but I've since lost him completely, a Canadian called Martin Lyons. Martin took all the photographs that you will see subsequently. Hassan Fathi's, of Hassan Bey. Hassan Fathi's engagement, as I said, was in the construction of vaults and domes, and so he was concerned with training builders and young masons in order to assist him in the construction of Gurna. Gurna was constructed in the 40s, and the building you saw previously, you can see, was later kind of rendered in mud brick. And his other big project was one known as Bariz. And you can see the plan here. And you can see how it relates also to what we were talking about in the geometry and the symmetry and the order that he used in his planning. And again, it's based on the unit, because in construction, when you build with vaults and domes, you are subjected to a specific kind of dimension, because the vaults in sun-dried mud brick in Cairo would only span 3 meters, hence the width of the room cannot be beyond 5. And so the entire design was based upon the technology. And the technology aided in creating the design, as opposed to the design being led by technology, as we currently have become. And Bariz was one of his most successful projects. It was constructed and it still exists. And this is the new market. And you can see the courtyard, basically, with the shops around it. And then he was also terribly successful with the construction of private homes and houses. The plan on the left is of his house in Sidi Krer, and you can see how essentially there's a central dome for the living area, which is known as a qa'a, and then there's the area surrounding it called a durqa, a courtyard, always a terrace in that case, the entrance from here, the bathroom, which had a beautiful dome that you see up here, and this is a view of the facade. Sidi Krer is near Alexandria. The one on the right was built also, both these houses are constructed in stone, and the one on the right is the house of Fuad Riyad, which was constructed near the pyramids. This is a view of the facade of Sidi Krer as you saw it, and this is the patio looking out, and that's the bathroom I told you about. It had a huge, beautiful dome, and this is the kitchen. This is when I went there in 1975 to work with him, and this is Hassan Bey, and this is Fayed Shukri, who was working with us, and we were doing a project for Fayed, who was an architect, and at the same time the client, if you like, which was rather extraordinary. I was helping him at the time write up the document that he was researching and documenting on mosque architecture. And it's a very sensitive subject, designing and building mosques, because all Arab and Muslim architects to this day hardly know how to design a mosque. Because again, it's built on certain and specific disciplines which were never taken into account, especially when modern architecture came in, promoting construction with concrete, which made it very difficult then for them to follow the same rules, or they felt they ought to modernize, and as we say in English, they lost the plot. So this is a note that Hassan Fathi had left me before traveling, on how he was thinking about the design. And what's very sweet about this note is that he writes me that this is the pink is the unclean area when you enter, and then you can look at them. This is the entire prayer area and the dome, etc. And then in the middle, he says to me, you know, I can't think about it anymore, and I'm not sure about this, or I'm not sure about that. I don't know if you can read it. But then he says, you know, religion is about facility. Ad-deenu yusr, وَلَيْسَ عُسْر. And it's not about difficulty and complexity. So it will be resolved. And these photographs were taken by Hassan Bey giving a lecture at the academy. He was completely withdrawn, and after Gurna was so-called failed as a project because the town was inundated and it was designed to perfection, so perhaps that was one of the problems, but essential issue, as everybody probably knows or doesn't, that the inhabitants did not really want to live there. But as I said, most of his projects were drawn, illustrated, and some were built, not all of them. This is a house that he had designed in Azbat al-Basri, and this, we believe, these are some paintings that he did like Islamic miniatures, two-dimensional, and these are some in Fayoum, Lake Fayoum, which are also not built. I went back to work with Hassan Fathi. The slide on the right is the vicinity of Darb al-Labana. This is the house, and this is in 1984. And what I did when I went back was to work with him on editing his writings. And amongst these writings, because Hassan Fathi actually was also had a lot of humor, and so and he wrote plays. He wrote 3 plays, 2 which were rather long. One called Al-Mashrabiya, which you see. This is the cover of it. It was not fully illustrated. There was just this drawing, and I put a section that I had translated. It was written in Arabic, so I helped him in editing it. I wrote it out. I typed. I didn't type Arabic then, but we had it typed, and I also did a long interview with him on the subject called On the Poetics of Space. His other play was called Utopia. Of course, both of them are about love stories, both of them are about cultural alienation, and both of them are about unrequited love. So it's kind of interesting, this relationship, the tension that he always had between, architecture and being completely committed to it, and then he never spoke of passion really, but I'll read you a small section. He spoke about art, and but there was always this business of the loneliness, the aloneness, the alienation. Alienation was at the forefront of his agenda, at the forefront of all the problematic that he had to work with, or that we had to contend with. And of course, I agreed with him. These last 2 houses I'm showing of Hassan Fathi's were, the previous one was built in Lake Fayoum. It was for the Andrioli family, Caterina Andrioli and her husband, and they built it in Fayoum. It was built out of mud brick in the 80s, and it was built in 1982-83. And this is another house which was constructed in stone in the Delta region for somebody called Hassan Sharif. I went there while it was being constructed. And this is Hassan Fathi, the man contemplating. And what I want to say before I end is that he actually, his language was very, very simple. He often repeated that the city is made of the million axes that go into its making every moment. He should say, the city is the million axes, and then he would say, the city is the million axes that go into its making every moment. So I used to listen, I used to write. One day I asked him, I said, Hassan Bey, what are these million axes, And he responded, the crafts, my dear, the crafts. The crafts are the axes that go into the making of the city. And then he also said, it also deals with our social context, the social analyses of our people that he was deeply concerned with. This is further clarified in the relationship and contribution of the trio that he insisted on. The Sufi sage, initiating with his knowledge, be it the secrets I showed you and the geometric order, the canons and rules and order. These are this is the knowledge of the sage, the canons, rules and order, the master builder, who we learn from, and the craftsman. The lack of the inherited order in modern architecture results according to Hassan Fethi, instead in dominant chaos, bound by linearity, what he used to call T-square architecture. Before we had computers, we used to use the T-squares, which my students still do. And his sentences, therefore, were brief, they were poignant, and often metaphoric. He also spoke in riddles. And in a note I found from one of our conversations, dated October 15, 1984, he said, "Architecture is the art of building. So it is art and technique. And in art, you have to love. And you cannot produce art without love. The technique you learn at school." But we also know that neither I nor Hassan Fethi learned the techniques at school. We learned the vault, dome, brick, and mud technology from his Nubian master builders, and me from Yemen, where I'm going to take you. And I'm just going to give you an idea about the country before I move into my terrain. And this is Sana'a, the mythical, magical city of Sana'a that everybody sees. And it is a real city. People still live there. Every single house that you look at is for one family. And that's the trend of the mud tower houses. And these are some views inside the hara, or the quarters, meandering quarters that have been paved since Sana'a was listed, like Shibam, the other city I'll take you to, on the World Heritage List. These are some views of the Grand Mosque here below that is being renovated by Ronald Lucock, somebody else I worked with, who works with UNESCO, has been UNESCO's long leading expert on the heritage of Yemen. And funnily enough, I met Ron again at the AA in 1973, did with him a thesis on Islamic calligraphy, and then found him in Yemen in 1982, just by pure coincidence. And it was Ron who said to me, "Why don't you work in Shibam? We're working in Sana'a." And so these are views of the city. So he went back and is restoring now the Grand Mosque of Sana'a, which is one of the stunning examples of mosque architecture, actually. And these are some views, essentially, that this city is not just a beautiful city to look at. It's besides the point. It's a city that has its own culture, its own urban heritage. This urban heritage is being renewed and revived, and a lot of attention by the government is put into Sana'a, unlike the rest of the country. The two other listed cities are Shibam and Zabid. Zabid, as far as I'm concerned, should be striked off the list because nobody does anything there. And Shibam is in a terrible state, and that's why we are there, unfortunately. Now, this is a map of the Yemen, just to give you an idea. The areas in this beige, yellowish, kind of sick yellow color is the areas that I worked in and that I covered over a long period between 1982 or 1981 and 2000, or it was actually 1996. Yes, when I was last there in the first period, I was there. And it's this area where I did most of the research, the actual research. And Sana'a is based somewhere here, as you can see. However, when I started working in Yemen, the country was split in two. There was South Yemen and there was North Yemen. And South Yemen was a socialist country that was like the Cuba of the Middle East. So going there was really very difficult. I was blessed with the fact that I had friends and colleagues who were not only leftists, but also socialists and rather well connected, or Palestinian, and who had excellent kind of connections there, and luckily knew the Minister of Culture. And the Yemenis are very modest and nice people. Their ministers are people that you see, that you talk to, unlike the arrogance that we have in other Arab countries. And from Aden, where my base was, I traveled to various areas and basically discovered in 1987, quite later, that stone is also used, and it's still used to this day in the construction of high-rises that exist in the northern part of the country in this area called Yafa. When I went to Yafa in 1987, I think it was, they had not seen a foreign woman come and visit them, and it was one of the only areas that the British couldn't penetrate, because Aden and Hadramaut was the Eastern Protectorate, was part of the government of the, it was part of the Protectorate, and Aden was taken over by the British as a coaling station on their way to India. So Aden also incidentally has some of the most incredible and highly developed colonial architecture, which has been Victorian architecture, which has been completely neglected and left to dilapidate. The slide that you see on the right is a building constructed recently. This one was constructed in 2001, and it's constructed in Yafa. They build high-rises out of stone. And the one on the left is the old house, and they created this connection. The walls are entirely, and this is the terrain. When I went there the first time, there was no road. The roads, most of the areas I used to go to didn't have a road to get to. But in this case, Yafa, I remember it took us 7 hours to get there, and we had to chew qat. And I remember the boys telling me who were driving, and they said, you better chew, otherwise you're not going to make it. So we were chewing and chewing, and I got there with a migraine. But then after that, you know, you need to chew to sit and discuss and talk with the builders. What does research include? Research includes design, research includes working with the builders, research includes documentation, and research also includes drawing. So when we architects do research, we are really concerned not just with reading and writing, hardly, but much more with the actual understanding of how these buildings work in drawing, in doing plans, in talking to the builders, and in doing sections. This house belonged to a master builder, one of the people working with us, who's called Bin Mas'ad, and he comes from an area in Yafa that is called Al Bin Salah, that is an area completely inhabited by master builders. And they build in stone. Their walls are in stone, their ceilings are in stone, and no columns are used. Their beams are in stone, and apart from the wood they use, everything else is in stone. And they construct their walls by creating double-skinned buildings. The interior they call the lining, al-batana, and the exterior, which is the external skin that they call al-zahara. So it's the outer and the inner, which is very interesting, because again, when you go and you look at some of the understanding of Sufi knowledge, there's always the zahir, which is the apparent, and al-batin, which is the hidden or the real. And so this is to tell you that it's not only mud brick that creates these high-rise buildings. It's not only mud brick, it's also stone. And in Yemen, such is the genius of the master builders that they have kept constructing these buildings. This is not from Hadramaut. The picture on the left is from Bayhan. And I used to take these photographs in black and white and develop them, and we don't do this anymore. So I scanned this, and it just gives a different feel and spirit. And I visited Bayhan in 87. And on the left are 3 models to show the tower house in Yemen. And these all concern South Yemen, yes, where I was working, south and the eastern province. We shouldn't say south anymore because the Yemenis get a bit upset. They consider that form of a political statement. I've always been accused of being a southerner, by the way. That doesn't bother me. Yafa and the Al Bin Salah building, this model is in stone. And this is a model, and you can see how many stories they are, yes? You can count 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And the kitchen in Yafa was always at the top, which is very interesting. The ground floor is always used for socializing by the men. The upper floors are all for the women to deal with, and the men come and visit. Otherwise, the men spend their time in this section, and it's also used for storage. And this is a mansion, a palace that belongs to the Alewa family in Habban, near Bayhan in Ataq in the Shabwa region, which is on the border of Hadramaut. And this is a building on the right that is constructed. So this is stone on the left, mud brick, and this is built in shale. And what is shale? Shale in Arabic or in Yemeni is called girf. And if you look closely at these, at the facade here, you will see, or at this one, black and white, you will see that they are very thin slabs of crystallized or solidified mud, which feels almost like stone and as hard as stone. And it's a sediment which is found, it's known as shale in English, and it's a sediment found near limestone, quarried in the areas near the limestone. The one on the left is another building. It looks as if it's a couple of stories, but actually we're looking at a facade where there are no openings because the basement, the ground, and the first floor are all used for storage, and the upper floors here, as you can see in the next slide, and the two upper floors, 3, are used for living. This is constructed completely in shale. Now, we go to Hadramaut, and this is the largest province in Yemen, and this is the province where I've spent most of my, I don't know if I should say my architecture life, but most of my work in Yemen. When I first went there, it was in 1981. This is Wadi Hadramaut that is famous and everybody knows. And in this wadi are the cities of Shibam and Tarim. And I incidentally did my PhD. I studied these two cities and my PhD was on them and on the builders there. And Shibam was considered the commercial capital of ancient Yemen, and Tarim was considered the religious capital. And then this is the area that is known as Doan, that you can see. It says, I'm sorry, archaeological sites, but it was a mistake by the illustrator who was doing these for me. These are the towns, actually, all the towns, the squares that you see here. This area I'm circulating is the area where I have spent the second part of my Yemeni chapter, or the second chapter, continuing chapter of my architecture life in Yemen is here. The first one was in that area in Wadi Hadramaut. To go back to just the point I was trying to make about research is that there's always students, or my students always think that there's a problem that when I say research, that it's boring, it means reading books, and I always try to explain that research and design need to come together. They are not two different fields, and when they are different fields, they can work in parallel. There is no formula for bringing these two together, but they can go on together, and one needs to always inform the other. This is a view of the city of Mukalla, which was the capital of Hadramaut, the coastal capital of Hadramaut, and some views of the interiors of the, this is the house that we surveyed here, and that's another one. So I'm just taking a photograph to show you the proximity and how these houses are fixed in the cluster of the plan. This is the oldest quarter in Mukalla, of which very little remains, unfortunately. It's known as Harat al-Bilad, or al-Bilad being the old sector of town, and some views of the interior of that. And Mukalla is entirely built out of stone. And you can see these screens here that are like the jali I showed you in India, except they're made out of stucco or lime plaster. When we move to the interior of Hadramaut, we come to the town called Sayoun. And in Sayoun is this palace, which is believed to be the largest building constructed in mud brick. And it's actually constructed in sun-dried mud brick, not baked bricks. And the entire of Hadramaut is done like that. Sana'a is constructed partially in baked brick. This palace in Sayoun, in Wadi Hadramaut, has a total area of nearly 6,000 square meters, and it's 34 meters in height. Of course, the building has been renewed and continuously renewed, but it was one of the first buildings I clapped my eyes on. I had a glimpse of when I arrived in 1981. And you could see in the back that the sur, or the encompassing wall, was being reconstructed when I took this photograph. Now, where are we? In the middle of Hadramaut, which I call the kingdom of mud brick. And I decided this from when I arrived, and I was just so taken by what I saw, and the buildings, and the entire complexity, and the life and the cachet that it had, kind of, and the spirit of the place, if you like, and the spirit of the space that it gave you, that I thought, you know, this is a world I can revel in and revel in forever. And so what is this mud or mud brick that we talk of, which in Arabic, incidentally, is called in Yemen madar? And if you go back to the old references, pre-Islamic history, Arab history, we find that Madar, the people of the Madar, were the people who were known as the civilized, because they were the people who built the civilization. So the builders, the ancient builders of Yemen, I believe, are the ones who were called Ahl al-Madar. And this is a view of the silt, where the mud comes from, and it comes from the areas below where the palm trees are, which is the most kind of silty, or what is known as loam, L-O-A-M. And then we see that this earth is then created into these bricks, or, as I told you, we have the option of building with stone, where lime is used as mortar, or mud is used as mortar, shale that you see below here, and shale again, another form of shale here. And at the same time, all of this is eventually covered in this lime, very fine, refined paste that is called Nura. Now, I'm just going to show you this very short film, if it works, on the making of mud brick for the benefit of our students. Just takes you through the process and shows you the making, the mixing. This video was based on a set of photographs taken by Roger Mukarzil, who's a Lebanese photographer that came out with me to Yemen in 2011 when we were organizing a conference. And he did a beautiful series of photographs, and I asked him to put this together, which we have done actually for the exhibition of the Re-Enchant the World. So, but it's a first cut, Mary Ellen, don't worry. And there's some beautiful music attached to it, which I've refrained from subjecting you to. And it just shows the different types of bricks. We've looked at how bricks are made, how bricks are mixed, how bricks are stored when they're not used. And now we're looking at how bricks are built. And you can see how thin the brick is. And this is the refined art of building with bricks. The fact that the largest brick is 52 centimeters long, 37 to 40 wide, 5 to 6 centimeters thin, I should say, as opposed to thick. And you can see, and they are quite heavy, by the way, to handle. And you can see that the construction takes place in actually all our walls are built in load-bearing walls on the exterior. And these can be up to a meter, 80 centimeters to a meter in meter 20 in thickness. And we use a system known as the midmak, which is the header and stretcher type of brick. And after this, partition walls are used that are made in either header or stretcher to be lighter. There are different types of bricks, and the one I showed you was actually the largest. And every brick has a name. Every size has a different name. Every context has a different type of brick. And we start with the Abadi brick, or the brick that they call al-mudir, the manager or director, and then we move on to the smallest brick that they use in the roofs that are extremely thin, down to 15 centimeters. And this is the Nura, or the lime paste I was telling you about. And essentially, lime is quarried, extracted, burnt for days sometimes, brought out. It's then soaked in baths that I'll show you in a second, and afterwards it's beaten and made into a very, very light paste, and that paste, thick paste, sorry, and that paste is very, very, very creamy, and it's used in 4 or different types of applications that you see now in some of the photographs and interiors. As I say, this is a draft cut, so there are many things that need to go. But you saw a sequence of photographs starting with the Mashhad al-Attas and going into Shibam, so we were not terribly in order. Now, I hope I can get us back to the second slide. Yes, so this is where the Nura Workshops are, and you can see how the Nura is actually manufactured by these workshops in Tarim. The Tarimis are the best builders, and they are the best producers of Nura. So the quality of Nura in Tarim is so good that it actually gets exported to the rest of the country, including Sana'a and the north. And here you see the workmen there, and this is Omar, who has been my driver and companion over the last 7 or 8 years. And this is Shibam, the city where I was working, I told you, from 1981 to 1990, 91, 92. And these are views of the various facades of the city. And this is the western view with the Sheikh Ma'ruf Mosque that you see on the outside. Sheikh Ma'ruf Bajamal was a Sufi. There's some of the information on the screen. And you can see the plan on the right with the main courtyard and some of the columns. The mosque was renovated, not by us, but by a group funded by the GTZ, the German group, and they were working in Shibam. They are the Shibam Urban Development Project, which evacuated in 2007 because of 7 or 9. Anyway, or 2000, I can't remember, 2009, I think. And the important thing to show is that this ancient mosque that you saw, after being renovated, shows how new and modern and clean it is. And this is only in order to tell you that there is no architecture that is as possible to renovate like mud brick architecture, renovate, modernize, and innovate with. And I just want to show you a series of, I consider Hadramaut to be a catalogue of architecture, and in it is a series of a catalogue of domes, I call them. The one on the left is Mashhad al-Attas in Hurayda, and the one on the right is in Taris, outside. Actually, it's after Hajarin, not in Hurayda, but the Attas was from the Al-Attas were from Hurayda, and the builder constructed this sanctuary for the warring tribes to come and have peace there. They couldn't use their weaponry or fight in that area. It's also the mouth to Wadi Do'an. And this is Al-Hajarain, just to show you that there are other cities other than Shibam that are constructed out of mud brick and are just as stupendous, and unfortunately are falling into disrepair, dilapidation. Buildings are being pulled down, the mosques are being demolished and reconstructed in most hideous ways, looking like Saudi or Gulf counterparts in concrete. And it's, of course, a huge crime and scandal But in Yemen, there's nobody to listen. Or in the Arab world, thank you very much. And this is part 4. There was an interruption in my so-called professional, I don't call it professional, in my architectural kind of engagement, let's say, between... I stopped going to Yemen in 1996, and I got engaged, and it was politics, essentially, and I think it's mainly because I found there was a lot of tension, political tension, that I never wanted to be a part of. But in the end, you know, I think architecture is one of the most political professions one goes into, and you would be kidding yourself if it were otherwise. And here is another political issue, that in 2001, shortly after 9/11, I, with 2 other, actually we were, a group of people was invited to go to Abu Dhabi to consult on the construction or demolition of the Sheikh Zayed Mosque. When I arrived, I was with Ismail Sirajuddin of the Biblioteca Alexandrina, and Mohammed Al-Assad, who is another colleague, graduate of the Aga Khan from Harvard, I think. And when I arrived, this mosque looked in this way. There was a huge dispute between Giglio, the Italian contractors in charge of it. The so-called architect, who was not an architect, had been dismissed into oblivion. Nobody knew who he was. And there was a huge settlement, in huge figures, unmentionable figures, between Giglio and the Public Works Department, who invited us to go. Because of 9/11, our foreign counterparts did not come. They thought the entire Middle East was going to elapse in flames. And there was this building, and we were consulted whether we should demolish and rebuild anew. And this is what Sultan bin Zayed, who was the sheikh who had invited us, and the second son of Zayed, had asked for our advice on. The advice, finally, he accepted: do not demolish, just get on with it. And now it is considered one of the landmarks of Abu Dhabi, if you like. But I will just show you what my role was. I arrived, the building was a skeleton, and it was an ugly skeleton, but the concrete work was very beautiful. And in another world, you would have left the concrete, but no, they wanted everything covered in marble, and they wanted everything covered in white marble. And the white marble had to be the marble of the Taj Mahal, you know? It was just like that, and you couldn't negotiate. So what do? We get marble from Makrana. We have to get marble from Makrana. I contact my Indian friends, and although I was against quarrying the Makrana marble, and Makrana marble was quarried, it was arranged. I, in the meantime, tried to convince Sultan that we should invite architects, and he was interested in inviting architects who had done big projects, huge projects. So I showed him examples, and I said, look, Herzog and Demeron have just done the modern Tate. Why don't we get them? Yes, brilliant, get them. I want somebody else. Go and look at the stuff. I say, how about Paul Andrew? Why? I said, he did the Charles de Gaulle, you know, it's a huge building. This is supposed to be the biggest mosque, so we need architects who can design big or understand big. He was very keen on Andrew and brought him, and Herzog and Demeron came. In the meantime, Renzo Piano was being invited to do a theater. I invited Renzo to come and do the theater. No one in Abu Dhabi had heard who Renzo Piano was, and I was vilified for inviting a man that and had done this without, you know, kind of creating contracts and takes and stuff like that. So Sultan and Renzo had an excellent relationship, And Renzo told Sultan, don't do anything with this. I will not touch it. Finish it as quickly as possible. And Renzo told me, finish it as quickly as possible. I told Renzo, I cannot. You know, it's unmanageable. And something's happened here. Okay, and as a result, you know, in the end, although, Nouvel was also invited. Nouvel did an excellent design for this mosque. And one day when I publish my story, I will hopefully get his permission to publish these designs. He did a beautiful, complete, comprehensive job. But Sultan did not get on with Jean Nouvel. And there was a tension between the two, and Sultan walked out. He thought that all the patterns that Nouvel did were based on 6-pointed stars and crosses, which I didn't see, but somebody else did. But never mind. Herzog and de Meuron did 3 excellent designs and a model, which they exhibited as part of their work at the Tate. Sultan didn't like their work. The tragedy was when Sultan came to me and he said, you and I are going to do this mosque. Of course, every prince thinks he's an architect. And then he didn't want to involve any Arab architects, so we had to set up workshops. As I said, I solicited with my friends in India. We brought the marble. We finally convinced, he wanted somebody, one of our friends, Fantini, who came to help us with the marbles and the mosaics, because we were seeing everybody who worked in the crafts and everything. Cut a long story short, Fantini got the contract to do the mosaics. He brought in Spatium, an Italian firm, and they all had to work on the 5-pointed star, because this is what Sultan was interested in. He didn't want the square. He was quite original, I have to admit, and rather creative. And so he set the perimeters. He said we wanted patterns for 5-pointed squares, and we don't want the building to look Islamic, he said. It already did with all the domes, of course. And for the calligraphy, he decided that he was going to choose this script here, which was the first documented script that is alleged to have been found in a letter from the Prophet Muhammad being sent to somewhere. And it's a script that is hardly known in Arabic and is considered to be a cursive script. It was terribly original. It was executed. And I brought in the Moroccan craftsmen to do the work in gypsum. And what you're looking at are just samples. We used to do 1-to-1 samples. So I had a workshop of Moroccan gypsum workers. I had a workshop of, and this is a model of one of the domes, and this is a design on the left that I had done of a dome that was being carved. Unfortunately, I was not destined to stay and see the result, and I brought in the Zilij craftsmen, whom I had met in Morocco because I had done a book on Zilij in Morocco, and I had met all these people when I worked in Morocco and did the publication and a huge exhibition at the Royal College of Art on the subject of Zilij, which is one of my favorite subjects to this day. And so these are samples of the floors that we were doing. And I also brought in a set of artists who came to work with me. Most of them were my friends. I brought in Mark Quinn from the UK, and he did a beautiful design of flowers for the mosque, because Sultan was also obsessed with flowers. And who else? And I brought Chihouli to do the lights of the building, Dale Chihouli's group, and people from Costa Boda in Sweden. This was a huge factory, a very enjoyable factory of art that was being in the making. On the left, you can see some tiles that were being made by, the top one was made, actually these two were made by Dia Al-Azawi, who's a painter and artist friend who came to work with us a little bit, just with some designs. And this is a flower that I had designed for the stucco work, and it was executed by my friend Smail Fattah, who was a sculptor who unfortunately has died since, who did the capitals of the columns based on the palm leaf. Abu Dhabi was not to be, because as I tell you, every project is politics, and there was no more a political project than this one. And I, of course, was completely oblivious. It's nice sometimes to be naive or completely withdrawn in what one does with the pressure and the tensions. But I didn't used to see anybody or talk to anybody. I saw Sultan, I was project managing, I had to organize, I was running the show. Plus, this was one of several other projects I was conducting. There was the island that Renzo was designing the cultural center for, and there were all the private palaces and projects I had to run, including the prince not being happy with this or rejecting that, and find me an architect and find me the furniture and all of that, plus having to deal with all the visitors we were getting. But one day, out of the blue, in 2004, I got a phone call saying, "You are no longer responsible for the mosque." And I said, "Fantastic. When do I leave?" They said, "Now." When I left, I realized, I realized 2 days later that it was my prince who was deposed from his position. But he cannot be deposed. He's the second son of Zayed. And he was going to be removed from being the crown prince because he's entitled to being in the second position. And so I had to be the sacrifice, I presume. It was very much to my benefit, of course. But the sad part is that they were worried about who was going to conduct this work after I left. I don't often talk about myself, but they kept me there for 3 months, worried and panicked, and sending people all the time to interview me on how I did this and how I did that and where I kept everything. I gave them the whole drill in an hour and a half, which I recorded, and I hope one day to be able to publish this. But after I left and I went back to England, I suppose they thought that I was going to resign from my job gracefully and beg for court and favor and stay there and become, retire eventually as being very rich. I just wanted out as soon as possible. So I asked the British Embassy to intervene and to get my passport, and left the country in May. This project has since become the most important project. No sooner did we leave, did they check out all the Makrana marble into the basement, and it was all about creating a new marble contract. So a new marble contract was forged with ceviche marble that was white. All the craftsmen were terminated. They used all our models and brought in their own manufacturers and produced everything, industrialized, kept some of our designs. And what little is left, I don't even like to take credit to. This was serving my professional time, but it's just to show that there isn't much of a separation, actually, between when you do research and when you handle big projects. It's not the size, it's the quality. I go back to Doan and Hadramaut in 2005, and I am fortunate enough to meet with the owner of this humongous palace that you see here, which had just been so badly, unfortunately, painted. Previously, it used to be in pastel colors like that, but one of the contractors, who were terribly shishi, as they all are now, had renovated it for him. And you can see a section here of the building and some slides of the ground floor, which was completely used for storage, and a courtyard. In the Doan houses, you always have courtyards that you don't have inside Hadramaut. And the living actually starts on the first floor. But most importantly is, unlike anywhere else in the Arab world, or I believe anywhere, except recently, these buildings, and this one was constructed in 1954, 53, were constructed as independent apartments. Every room had its own living room, its own bathroom, its own cupboard, and its own key. So they were like separate apartments. And this explains why a building on 6th floor should have this number of rooms, which comes to 60 at least. But again, in the Bedou culture, and the owner is originally a Bedouin, they always, people who have money construct houses and house whoever has not a place or travelers and guests. So you see these rooms are always full, even when he's not there. Even when I first visited this area in 1978, and I hadn't, or 77, I can't, 78 I think it was, or 87, sorry, 87, yeah. And I hadn't met him, I stayed there. And I was fascinated. This is a view on the, of Wadi Doan, and this is the site that we have renovated in part, and that we, where the work has now stopped, sadly because of political reasons. I haven't told you what a difficult country Yemen is to work in, and interestingly enough, with the changes of time and history, over the last over the last 3 decades that I think I've been there, since the early 80s, that it's the problem is not with the fact that I'm a woman. I always felt I was at a great advantage actually being a woman in Yemen, because Yemeni men, at least, are very, very gentle with women and very respectful of women. Or I found that, maybe, and they were fascinated by the fact that I could speak Arabic, and as far as they're concerned, I did not look Arab. I had to convince them that I was Arab, and they were in awe of me because I came from Iraq, because their religious kind of Sufis and the elites of Hadramaut originally are supposed to have had descended from Iraq. So I am always in this very fortunate position. Unfortunately, of late, with this, this is a site plan of the area that we selected. And this is Masna' Doan, Ura, which is very central to the work I do there. And after I laid eyes on it, I convinced Abdallah Bukshan, who's the owner of the house I showed you, because he was looking for a landmark to create a hotel in, I convinced him that he should take this area and renovate it. And I also convinced him that we should set up a foundation and have him as sponsor of the foundation, and he accepted. And it has been wonderful to set up this foundation, which we set up later. But we started working, we surveyed the entire site. This site belonged to the Basurra family, who were the rulers on behalf of the Qaitis, one of the sultanates that ruled. And these are some views of the interiors of the houses that had not been lived in for 40 years, because most of the business and learned families of South Yemen immigrated after the socialist state took place and the government came to power in 1967. They immigrated some much earlier in the 40s and the 50s, like the Bukshans and the Amoudis and some of the richest families of Saudi Arabia, contractors and businessmen, the men who were really behind the financial brain, if you like, and the commerce of Saudi Arabia are well known to be the Hadramis in particular. So these houses were abandoned, and left abandoned. Of course, they remained in great form and shape. And the reason we set up this foundation was essentially in order to work on the fact that these buildings will not just happen or continue to happen. We have to create a statement, and this statement is about transformation, and the transformation not only of knowledge, but the transformation also of design and building for the future. And in fact, incidentally, Hassan Fathi would always talk about the future. And I have always said and maintained that this architecture I work with, and this is a section that you see and some plans of the building, are buildings that we have to develop for the future, because they are way far more advanced than anything that is being created in the present. And this is very important. And as I said previously, I don't even believe in the work we do that there is a line that divides the past from the present or the future. I believe this line that divides the past from the future to be fictional, in my dictionary at least. And I believe we architects need history and the past. We need to work with it, we need to learn from it, and we need to deliberate and understand it better in order to be innovative for the future. And so this house, I was showing you the section of collapsed, and we had to come to the rescue. And that's when we got some money and movement, essentially from the Prince Claus Fund, but also sponsored by the client. And this shows that the storage areas were built in with urns on the ground floors of the building, and the rest of the floors were used for living. The sophistication is not only in the building, but it's also in the woodwork and in the decoration. And this was in the reconstruction that we did in 2008 and 9, second phase of reconstruction of the kitchen that had collapsed. And you can see how new these buildings look once they have been renovated. We also tend to pull down sections of buildings and reconstruct them, as in the case of the wall. This is one of the houses that this is all still on the same site, that we restored, one of the house of Ali Basura, and the interior views of the houses that shows that very little renovation is needed there. But on the ground floor, we do a lot of surgical renovation, which is much more engineering, if you like, than architecture. And it concerns reinforcing these buildings, introducing new membranes like wood, creating areas here that we span with steel pipes sometimes, and embedded, cavities are created embedded with columns in wood that work like tie rods, and then plaster everything, and it looks back to new. So I'll just show you some photographs of the work that we finished in Masna'at Aura, and some new construction that is being done there. This work had to stop, unfortunately, because of the political situation in 2011. We finished the house completely, and this is the house here, and as a prototype for the rest of the site. And this is what it's looking like now. But we reinforced the site so that it is not subjected to any more damage or collapse or demolition, and all the work that we need to do now is on the interiors and the reconstruction of the section that has collapsed. So it's very important to understand that when the word heritage is discussed, for me heritage is like water. You know, you don't talk about water, you drink water. You don't talk about food, you eat food, you know. So if we have to work with heritage, and if heritage is the word, then is it, I question, the inherited order? I like to refer to culture, to urban culture, as the word which I prefer the most, and I consider this to be a strategy for development. This is the construction of the road behind Masna' here, because there was no road, and interestingly, the people of the village did not want us to build a road that would go inside their village. So we decided to do a road from outside the village, and it would lead to the area up here. And as you can see, the old system included agriculture, orchards, and a cistern of water that used to be filled and provide water to every single house. Every single house had its own pool and supply of water. And this is a view of the facade after it was renovated in 2011. Now, I'm going to move very quickly and show you, because I want to just discuss two things, and I think I'm running out of time, if I'm not mistaken. And this is a mosque that we renovated. It's the Mosque of Aynat, it's the Mosque of Sah. It's the Mosque of Sah. And in this mosque that was being renovated, we constructed, I think I'm going back here. Okay, so this is a mosque that it's not really a mosque, it's a dome, it's the tomb, and it's known as the Qubba. Qubba in Arabic means capital, but in Yemen it's used to refer to a wali's shrine, or the saint's abode. And in this case, this was a very quaint mosque I saw, it had beautifully shaped columns that you see here on the right-hand side, and this is the building on the exterior. austere, minimalist, nothing, a beautiful old minaret, you know, it hadn't been pulled down and reconstructed. And you could see what I mean by the tactile feel of these sculpted, almost sculpted arches that you see in the building. I mean, there's so much material to show that I feel sorry sometimes I have to squeeze 4 or 5 photographs, or 6 in this case. 7 in this case, sorry. And this is the state and condition of the building when we arrived there. We were begged by the people there and the community to come to the assistance of this deserted, isolated, what's known as mazar, because people go and stay there and spend the day there. They even have their picnics there, and it's a tradition, part of the tradition, to visit the tombs of the Sufi pious walis that there are many of in Hadramaut. And this is just a view of the plan here, the main dome where our wali is buried, and his name, he's called Omar Bawazir, and this area is called Ghail Bawazir in Sah. I went there in 2007 after the floods occurred, 2008, after the floods occurred, and swept complete villages in Wadi Hadramaut. We have spate floods in Wadi Hadramaut, and so they're quite dangerous. This guy here is one of the my closest builders. He is a builder who is just specialized in the act of resuscitating and reinforcing, meaning bringing back to life and shoring a building, but bringing it back to life in full health. He's the one who is brought to take care of a collapsing wall, a collapsing building. He reinforces and he goes. He doesn't stay. And he inherited this métier and the know-how from his father, who I met when I first went there. The man on the right was my builder. Unfortunately, he left us and departed 2 years ago. He died. And the man behind is my site architect, who I trained and is probably the only person. He's my right hand there. And you can see here that there are certain decisions we need to take with the builders. And in this case, we needed to construct a new set of columns in that area to buttress the columns against the main prayer hall. And this is these are the arcades in construction that you see here. And in the next slide, you will see how many of the membranes of the planks and the boards that are used for the ceiling are removed and actually replaced, and so are these parts that are used from the local wood. And we make sure that we use the same traditional materials. I don't allow them to use any cement, not even in the foundation, and everything has to be done with the original stuff. And if there is need for, and we use a lot of stone pillars to reinforce the ground floors of mud brick buildings. So you can see here that we had stone pillars embedded there. You can see the builders working. And this is inside the sanctuary of the burial of Sheikh Omar. And these are the areas after they've been covered, and that's the builder. And then what we do is we indicate in each area the number of surgical enforcements that we have to make inside the walls, and we create the cavities for them, as you saw. And we also need to preserve any relics, or in this case, documents that might exist inside the mosque. And in this case, it gives, it's written much later, but it gives it's written in the 13th century. That's the date on the tombstone. But this is one of the stones, because none of these tombs are normally identified, although there are tombstones, but they're not identified. And then what we do is, for example, I'll show you what the dome looked like before and how we scrape and remove everything and then clean it up, render it first with mud mortar, and then we use Nura. And then every time you renovate or you rebuild a mosque, you have to put in a plaque to date when it was done. And so we did this, and we wrote down that it was done by the foundation the Doğan Foundation for Architecture, and funded by the Prince Claus Fund, and I put in the Cultural Emergency Response here, who are our partners and have been since 2007. It's thanks to them that we've managed to do all this work, and thanks to them that this work has become a landmark now. And this is the mosque after it was renovated. We also reconstructed out of this state and rebuilt completely after demolishing 4 tombs that belonged to saints and walis. And the nicest story that my builders would come and tell me. So we reconstructed the walls and the domes, and you can see here. But the nicest story was that my builders would come and say to me once, twice, and 3 times. In the beginning, I didn't used to respond. Say to me, you know, Salma, because they call me Salma there, you know, Salma, your rewards in heaven are going to be doubled. I say, yes. Why? Say, it's because I'm fixing a mosque. No, no, no. You are building the tomb, the qubba, the dome of a Sufi master. You know what that means? I say, okay, okay, now you have to come and touch me and get my blessings. So every time they would say this, and I would say, yes, and when I'm in heaven, you see, I'm going to tell St. Peter not to let you in because you were stealing from us when we were working and all of that. So I worked them for a bit, but they seriously thought that my rewards are now. And you know, for them, they're doubly touched by the fact that it's a woman who came and is doing this work for them. So that is one form of appreciation, which is nice. And there is a culture of this is a huge cemetery in Aynat that is quite famous, known as the 7 Domes, but it now has over 70. And there we also restored another mosque, which is the oldest mosque that was constructed in Aynat. And it's a very revered mosque because it again belongs to one of the most important Sufis who was the initiator of the Alawi school in Hadramaut, and his name is, as you can see, Al-Faqih Al-Muqaddam Muhammad bin Ali Ba'alawi. And the Ba'alawis are the, I told you, the descendants of this family that came from Basra in southern Iraq of Sufis. And they established the Sunni following, if you like, because prior to that, most of the Muslims were Ibadis before they became Shafi'i now. And so this is, again, a view of the mosque, and it was beautifully renovated and completed. It's the Mosque of Aynat. But these 2 projects are going to be exhibited in May, so you'll be able to look at them, and well documented in by Marie-Hélène Contal, so I'm very pleased about that. And this is the spirit of Hadramaut and Doğan. And finally, I'm just going to show you the last 2 projects that we've been working on, and apologize if I've gone a bit over my time. This is a fort, a husn, known as Garan Majid, and it's one of the most important forts that kind of looms over the fork that opens up Doğan. Doğan is as a wadi, it's a tributary from Wadi Hadramaut. You saw its location on the plan. And this wadi actually forks into the left and the right. And the left is where I showed you the Bukshan Palace was, and there's a few villages. And the right one is the one where most of these built-up towns where we have been working are. And Garan Majid sits on top of a rock that commands the view over this area. So it's in a very strategic position. And these are views of the interior of the building before we started working on it. And it was collapsing in part after the floods in 2011, and it was called to our attention. You can see the broken windows. And so I applied to get funding for this, again from the Prince Claus, and this was in 2010, or 11, sorry, in 2012. And after a huge dialogue and give and take, we got the funding in June. I signed the contract, went back in August, and this guy, the guy on the left is the builder who helped us. I mean, it's now finished. And this is one of the family representatives of they're called the Baqhoum family, who are representatives who you have to work with. You do not work in vacuum. You are working all the time with the inhabitants, who eventually become your clients, and you assign them as your clients, and you're doing the work in their favor. So this shows the various steps. We start with the exterior always, and then from the exterior we remove everything down to the skeleton of the building. And you can see here what we mean. We take everything out, and that's why I say it's almost like a surgical operation. And then when you renovate, you can see, for example, the difference in the forts on the left and on the right, and the ditto with the work. The external work has to be completed before we start with the interior, which you can take your time with the interior, but it's the exterior that's exposed to the rains. And this shows the kind of factory that we set up on site, dealing with the mud and the chaff and the straw. And of course, mules are forms of transport in this area where you don't have roads and cars can't get there. And you can see from this slide the fact that there's nothing called health and safety in that part of the world. Even common sense prevails in how they conduct their working operations, and there's no good convincing them that they need to wear helmets or boots. They would laugh at you. And they go to great risk. Thank God, up until now, we haven't lost anybody. In Abu Dhabi, we lost one Moroccan craftsman, unfortunately, because the scaffolding was so cheap. But these guys are wise and they are careful. And you can see how delicate the decorative sections are and how we have to take care of them in order to restore them. I normally bring them down, preserve them, and then reinstate them. And you can see here the different work that takes place with the Nura, the plaster, and ditto here. And this is Abdurrahman, the architect. And you can see from the next slide also the work that takes place in the ceilings. Everything has to be replaced. And you can tell that we're almost looking at a new building. And this is part of the team, two of my builders, one architect, a builder, and a helper here, and the owner representative, and a view of the renovation. I was a bit averse to the fact that we need to whitewash the building, but accepted for damp-proof reasons, and the fact that this Nura is the best kind of damp-proof course that you can put on the building to protect it. When I go and come back, I'll get some more photographs of what it looks like. I take you back to Shibam just to end. And here, where you see on the site plan, the green, are the two houses that we had to go and restore in the city. This is the city. It has several mosques, and you can see the skyline of the high-rise houses. I took the photograph from the roof of the building that we were called in to restore, but ended up rebuilding, demolishing and rebuilding. And this shows the terrace of the mosque on the left of the site, and this mosque is known as the Harun al-Rashid Mosque because it was alleged to have been constructed during the Abbasid Caliph al-Rashid's era. And you can see this here again. And this is the first house, which is called D25, which is located right here at the corner. So this is the mosque I was showing you, and the view of the roofscape was from all across here. And this is the second house that we did. So the first house, when we arrived originally, that section had collapsed completely, and the owners took it upon their own responsibility to bring down the material and leave it exposed. And they were hoping that we will come and reconstruct this section for them. And this is the kind of funding that we received. The second house is at the back here. This house is a very small house, the first one. The entrance is from here, and you can see the ground floor is always used for storage. The first floor, you start to use, you have your rooms for living, and an area which is the bathroom here, and then the second is the same, living, and a kitchen in this area, and a small toilet. And what's very important about the construction of these buildings, and I told you they are one house, is not the thickness on the ground floor here, and then look at the thickness when we come to the roof area. And this is what I told you the difference is. And the more interestingly is that these walls are called load-bearing walls, and they are the main crux and structure that is supporting the building. But also interestingly is the fact that we have the core of the staircase, which is this one, which in Shibam and in Hadramaut actually is called al-arus. Al-arus is meant to, it translates into the bride. And so this, the builder is considered to be the bride of the house. You know how to construct a arus, you know how to construct a house. And of course, with the metaphors related to it. More interestingly is in Yafa, the first place I showed you, where they build in stone. There the women, up until 1990, when unity was created, were the most liberated women in the country. And they never covered their faces or wore black. They would go out and work with the men. They wore beautiful robes. I have them photographed in my first book, Yemen Reality. And there, interestingly enough, that stair core is called al-fahl, which means the man. So it's interesting that in a liberated milieu where women are free and roam around, and apart from the fact that they were the most beautiful women the most beautiful women in Yemen, they and the women of Mahra, and command the highest dowry. So these women kind of, it's interesting, and they contributed to building, but the core of the house is called fahl. So the man there is the core of the house. In Hadramaut, the woman is the core of the house. So that's very interesting. This is the elevation, and this is the state we found the house in. And no sooner had we looked at the house, and shortly after getting, I brought in my own builder, the man I showed you, who I told you was the specialist in resuscitating and reinforcing, and his name is Break. And anyway, so the joke goes is that he puts the brake on houses in Hadramaut. Anyway, so this is the house, the interiors of the house, and eventually Break came and they got in touch with me. I was in London, and they said to me, Break said to me, you cannot reconstruct anything. You have to pull the house down and reconstruct it. Of course, I was very stubborn, and I said no, and we'll see, and I went, and I came, and they went, and then finally I was convinced. So we didn't have the budget to reconstruct, did we? Of course not. So I said to the guys in Yemen, I said, look, I brought you a budget to do up 2 houses. You bring me a budget to demolish and build a house. Sure enough, or I said, I have to return the money to the Prince Claus. Sure enough, it took 1 month. They got a contract from the Social Fund for Development, who is always bankrupt. They have millions of pounds in the bank, but they're always bankrupt. And they got the money, they got the contract, they signed it, they sent it to me, I released the money, they started building, and you can see the progress of the construction going on. And we have to go through drying processes, so we will not finish construction before June or July, but at least we have managed to rebuild a house or construct a new house. The second house belongs to this woman. Doesn't belong to her, but she's been living there, because most of these empty houses are houses that are then entrusted to people who can house sit when they are away, and it's also a form of welfare. So this woman was brilliant. She showed me all around the house and how she resuscitated and spent money on reinforcing her house. This is you saw the entrance there, which is here, and this is the alley leading to it, and that's the entrance from there. The men can't come in, so I go in, and she takes me to the kitchen, and she's showing me around and showing me all the problems and pointing where every single problem in the building is. This is a much more sophisticated house. It was owned by a trader, a merchant. The inhabitants of Shibam were all businessmen, and he's from the Ba Sahi family. And I don't know where they are at the moment, but he doesn't live there. And you can see the complexity. Again, the ground floor is never used for living. It's all storage here. And this house, this is the entrance. There's a light well, which provides light. It's a light tower, kind of, the shaft that comes in through the house. And the staircase is from here. So you literally kind of walk in and take the stairs. And then when you come to the first floor, you can already see the khor, the arus, and the stairs going anti-clockwise. The first area for living in is a living room. It's not for living quarter. It's for reception and socializing, and it's called mahdara. And the mahdara here has 2 columns, as you can see, and the windows that you see in the facade. This is the facade that you see on the street. This is the back where the other house is. And you will see some of the builders working on this side. So our mandate here was to assist the lady of the house in redoing the externals and fixing up the patio. As we go upstairs, you will find that there's another mahdara, but then we start to get rooms, and these rooms are used for sleeping in. And then on the second floor, a mahdara 2, third floor as well. And the patios that you saw are extremely well covered, and you can never see anybody through or across. I mean, the genius of designing these buildings in such a way that despite the proximity, nobody can look inside your house and you can't look inside the other. So naturally this was design. This was not an architecture without architects, as it has been documented in the past when it was first discovered. It is a vernacular architecture, and it's an architecture based on disciplines and rules. And it is these builders who educate us as architects, and it's our task the transmission translates in how we then convey this knowledge to our students, and how we publish it, and how we always have to continue training people to continue on the job. In order to train them to continue on the job, we need projects. And in the absence of these projects, I'm afraid we are stuck, and the architecture is stuck too. This is a view of the facade and the work that was being conducted in September and October on redoing the entire building on the exterior. It's a fascinating job. I have a short film which I will be editing later, but it shows you how the entire building skin is taken out, and then it is redressed using different courses of mortar and mud. We use 3 to 4 courses, and then after that it is smoothed, and Nura is used, as you can see here, and it is not used in one, but as I told you, it's used in 5 different coats until we get the shiny, marbleized kind of finish that you saw in some of the interiors. So this was the patio that you finished. And this shows a slide of what I was talking about. This is probably the 2nd or the 3rd coat, and this is the 4th, and then after this will be the final coat. And then as you see, the entire floors are also done in Nura, because this is the roof, and this is the most dangerous area where the water gets in and creates the collapse and caving in of these buildings, because after all, although they're protected, they are built in mud brick. And this is the final slide showing the correction and how the situation was before we touched it. And this is a small mihrab that exists in the patio showing the direction of Mecca. And it's interesting to note that the arch that they use in Yemen is the oji and the full arch, which was influenced by the Andalusians. Now, to end, I would just like to quote the Sheikh. I would like to read you a quote from Al-Sheikh Al-Akbar, Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, who I consider to be one of the most important inspirations and probably Sufi sheikhs or saints. And he died in 1240, so it's important to note what he says. And while he's talking about the alim, al-mushahid, or the Gnostic, i.e. the knower, he says, a prerequisite of the Gnostic, al-alim, he who is knowledgeable, is to know that places have an influence on subtle hearts. After that, he says, he continues and he explains the basic difference between a building with stone or a building with madar. And he says, there's no way that a building in stone is equal to like a building with madar. And then he says, so there is substantial difference between a city with most of its architecture built or made of lust or greed, and a city where most of its architecture is composed of the clear signs. My reading of the clear signs, or manifest or evident signs, relates to the paradigm based on compiled knowledge, established truth. This is what our cities should be made of. Thank you very much for your attention.